before I get started, I did just want to say thanks very much to the organizers for making this conference happen during, such challenging circumstances. It's a real pleasure to be able to get to participate and feel a part of this community, even though we're all so far apart. So my paper is called CA, Henrietta Shore and Expatriate Modernisms. And it is a title I have stolen rather shamelessly from the 2017 Getty Pacific Standard Time LA initiative, which was a collaborative exhibition project of more than 70 institutions across Southern California that focused on artistic connections between Los Angeles and Latin America, LA. The project is just one example of an increasing scholarly interest in Pan-American cultural networks. And yet, with a few important exceptions, art historical ventures that have adopted this framework have tended to neglect the northern end of the hemisphere, with little attention to Canada's place in these global dynamics. What connections might we find, then, between Canada, the United States, and Latin America? Or, in the rather more limited case of my talk today, between Canada and California, CA. Enter Henrietta Shore. Born in Toronto in 1880, Shore settled in Los Angeles in 1913, and after a stint in New York in the early 1920s, again in LA in 1924. She also spent time in Mexico in 1927-28, before finally moving north to Carmel in Central California in the 1930s, where she remained until her death in 1963. Through the early 20s, Shore experimented with biomorphic semi-abstractions like these, before turning to natural imagery with a crisp linearity and volumetric form that placed her in the company of artists such as Georgia O'Keeffe, to whom she was linked in reviews, and to F-64 photographer Edward Weston, who was one of her closest friends and colleagues. Indeed, Shore's work is typical of a Pan-American modernist visual vocabulary that was prominent in the interwar period, one backed by theosophist and transcendental philosophy that celebrated the universality of nature even as it targeted the specificities of place. Lake Superior, Taos, New Mexico, Mexico City, Carmel. As with her professional and personal connections to O'Keeffe and Weston, Shore was linked to Harris by reviewers and had worked with the photographer Tina Medotti in Mexico. Shore's vividly colored paintings of plant life, shells, and rocks seem rootless, objects floating unmoored in an undefined space, much like the experience of the peripatetic expatriate herself. In a 1946 interview, Shore declared that she belonged to nature rather than to any given country, recounting the story of when she first realized this. I was on my way home from school and saw myself reflected in a puddle. It was the first time I had seen my image completely surrounded by nature, and I suddenly had an overwhelming feeling of belonging to it, of actually being part of every tree and flower. Her friend Edward Weston echoed this, writing that in Shore's free-sweeping rhythms, grandly contrasted volumes, the artist realizes a fusion of her own ego with a deep universality. When she paints a flower, she is that flower. When she draws a rock, she is that rock. These images and the rhetoric of a universal nature that lies behind them would seem to lend themselves well to a nationally unbounded Pan-Americanism. But it is evident that Shore was not always comfortable with the incorporation of her work into wider hemispheric trends. And for the rest of my talk, I'd like to briefly introduce this tension by looking at these three works in conjunction with a heated exchange in the Canadian Forum in order to hopefully spark a conversation about the possibilities and limitations of a Pan-American critical framework then and now. So let's begin with the images. Once again, we find plants represented with little context, their stems emerging out of a rock, a gourd, and what appears to be perhaps another flower, each floating against the backdrop of an empty sky. The titles Canadian Weed and California Data, however, suggest more specificity of place than the images themselves reveal. The third, Floripondios, was painted in Mexico City. There's a strong visual similarity between the three in the rounded forms projecting from the bottom of the canvas and extending throughout the pictorial space. Ostensibly static, the stylized curving lines enliven the plants. One imagines the flowers and stems stretching and growing, straining at the edges of the canvases. This animation suggests the vital energy that Shore and her colleagues across North America believed underlay the universe. Viewed together, the images unite Canada, California, and Mexico in a space beyond national borders. Shore herself expressed a lack of allegiance to nation when writing to Weston from Mexico about Floripondios, calling the picture as good as any as I have done. She continued, "At last my eyes are open and I am willing to see. No one tells me now that I am a woman without a country, because I was not born in California and because I do not consider my people the only people. Her country was nature itself." But a few years later, Shore was again forced to think about the ways in which she and her work did or did not belong to national schools and transnational networks. When the Canadian critic Archibald Key published a short article in the July 1932 issue of Canadian Forum. The article was itself a response to a controversial essay by San Francisco Examiner art critic Jehan Beatrice Salinger on the so-called Canadian spirit in art. In his own article, Key recounts his trip to Carmel the year previous. His traveling companions were two A.Y. Jackson paintings, who, he says, accused him daily of transporting them into alien country. But he was pleased to find another Canadian in this foreign place, in the form of Shore, whose work he characterized as, quote, obstetrical and obscenely indecent. He illuminated the Canadian spirit in art, even as it suggested wider continental connections. Key compared Shore's representations of nature first to Harris's Northern landscapes, but also to Weston's California photos and the representations of Mexico painted by Jose Orozco and Diego Rivera. She despises the group of seven as she despises every other organized group, Key writes, but she speaks their language, just as she speaks in the language of the Mexicans and even a word or two of American. After grudgingly, he writes, pulling out of Shore that Canada had indeed influenced her work, he reports, "The night before we left Carmel, there was a wistful gleam in Henrietta's eyes. I wonder if Ontario has forgotten me. I should like to hear what Canada thinks of my work." "So would I," says Key. "One glance at the anatomical forms and the conservatives would petition for Henrietta's deportation. But those who perceive the one eternal truth in her work, that nature is infinite, will come to her defense." Shore responded in the following issue, beginning her short letter by threatening to sue for libel and demanding a public apology. She objected to Key's use of her first name, to his intimations of her poverty and eccentricity, to the idea that she was merely a follower of Weston's, and especially to the sexualization of her images, concluding that Key ought to seek a psychopathic examination. But Shore equally objected to her inclusion in the Pan-American network that Key attempted to draw between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, insisting that her interpretation was her own and decidedly distinct from contemporary trends, either in Canada or across the continent. It was, she writes, not possible for her to despise the group of seven because she did not know their work. Her work was compared to that of painters with which Key was unfamiliar, she says, merely because she had painted in the country where they had also worked. And so, even as the discourse of a universal nature that transcended national borders seems to have supported the development of Pan-American artistic trends, in the case of Shore, that same discourse evidently worked against such a network as well. And so to begin to open up the discussion, I'll conclude by saying that while Shore did in fact receive her apology from Key in the next issue of Canadian Forum, Jehan Beatrice Salinger also stepped back into the debate, agreeing with Key that Shore's work captured something of a transnational spirit in art. Her response, however, also brings a gendered perspective to the debate. When I saw the name of Lauren Harris and that of Henrietta Shore side by side in Mr. Key's article, she writes, what had been on my mind for some time suddenly took form, and I perceived how close these two artists are in the essence of their spirit and their art. Had Shore remained in Canada, it is not too bold to suggest that through the natural exercise of mutual stimulation, Lauren Harris might have reached a still more bold symbolism, while Shore might have been taken to even higher peaks than her kin. But uprooted, having to battle for her daily subsistence among strangers, finding herself on a footing of absolute equality with males in the United States, where feminism is taken more literally than that in Canada, this artist grew away from the shelter which would have afforded her in familiar, in familiar surroundings. The artist she is today is painfully detached from her roots, from herself. On leaving Canada, she continues, Shore chose to be second in Rome rather than first in her hometown. She has made the wrong choice. Thank you.